Coming up on Primetime Politics, warnings ignored.
There's no reason to have so many diplomats with a country that doesn't want to do business with us.
We'll speak with a former CSIS official who testified before committee this week. Why were warnings of Chinese interference and disruption ignored? Not just for years, but for decades. Michel Juneau-Katsuya will join us. Also, we'll speak to our journalist panel and get the latest on foreign interference, including Ottawa's reported move to create a foreign agents registry either before or just after the summer break. And how have wildfires affected Alberta's short 4-week election campaign? We will speak with Pollster Janet Brown. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Sarabio. Foreign interference continued to dominate discussions on Parliament Hill this week, with a former CSIS official appearing before committee and testifying it is not just an issue that's dogged this government, but all governments dating back to the 1980s, especially when it comes to the People's Republic of China. Take a listen.
Not only the sitting government have been compromised, but all federal political parties have been compromised at one point or another. The inaction of the federal government, all federal governments, were led to attacks on many municipal and provincial government. Ultimately, every government has been part of the problem, not the solution. And remember, not only China is practicing interference.
Well, with more, we're now joined by Michel Juneau-Katsuya, former CSIS intelligence officer, also former chief of the Asia-Pacific unit at CSIS. Michel, nice to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure. Thank you to invite me.
Listen, you made a couple of statements to the committee that really grabbed people's attentions. And the first had to do with warnings, in that you said, quote, we can prove that every federal government from Mulroney to Trudeau has been compromised by agents of Communist China. You go on to say that every government was informed at one point or another, and that every government chose to ignore these CSIS warnings. A lot to unpack there, but when you say that every government has been compromised, let's begin there. What do you mean by the fact that they were compromised?
Well, CSIS have been capable to identify agents of influence, people who were working on behalf of the Chinese government in the inner circles of every single prime minister. We saw also relationship built with the prime ministers that were sometimes questionable in terms of what they were bringing for Canada. And we've identified certain action and certain activities that literally sort of compromise the decision-making and the decision process of the prime ministers. So these agents of influence were literally capable to sort of affect the decision process and change the course of the decision process.
And as you say, these governments, each and every one, was warned at one point or another. So why were these warnings ignored?
Well, we can even see some old prime minister coming out of the woodwork lately and trying to diminish, again, the importance of the warning that we gave. And the reason why? Well, we can identify only 3 reasons. Those agents of influence that I'm talking about that were capable to influence the decision process, or partisanship, as we've seen as well, or simply self-serving interests of certain individuals that basically put their self-interest or their own interests ahead of the Canadian government or the Canadian nation.
Now, you say currently there are at least 70% of China's diplomats here in Canada that are essentially part of intelligence gathering work, and you say they should be sent home. That's a pretty high figure. How did you arrive to that?
Well, again, we've been monitoring activities of many countries, and we know that diplomatic coverage is a cover for many spy activities. In the case of China, we have a trade deficit with that country. In the U.S., we have, which is our the number 1 economic partner. Well, when we compare the number of diplomats in place, China has twice as much, the double in numbers, and we have a trade deficit. In recent years, they succeeded in convincing the Harper government, for example, to sell an energy company in Alberta for $15 billion and we're not even capable to buy a corner store in China. So this inequity between the countries is sort of upset even more when we know that this authoritarian country is also supervising it and monitoring our Chinese community here and influencing them in going in certain direction. So we don't need that many Chinese diplomats here. They don't want to do business with us. They don't want to have a sort of a good relationship with us. Return them home. We don't need them.
So why is China and the People's Republic engaged in this level of intelligence gathering? Is it to destabilize Canada? Is it to serve as a backdoor to the United States? What is the overall purpose here?
There's many purposes. You named two of them to a certain extent. They want to be capable to sort of control the mechanism and the discourse of the Canadian government when it comes to China. They don't want to have anybody to have a negative say, so they want to control the discourse of anybody, dissident and government officials. But they want also at the same time to get access to a lot of our resources. Canada is one of the prime targets for them. And unfortunately, for so many years, because they successfully been able to sort of manipulate some of our prime ministers, they were capable to sort of gain a lot of advantage for themselves. So their positioning here is really, really important. Give them access and opening to the Western world, give them access to our technology. Canada is a knowledge-based society. We lose an average of $100 to $120 billion per year in theft of intellectual property. And a lot of that is lost to the Chinese. And we barely know anything about it because the government prevents CSIS to talk openly about it. So we need now to be very candid, very transparent, and realize that if we want to play in this international scene, we need to be much more armed with a much more robust national security and being conscious of the attack that has been launched against our democratic system.
Quickly losing time, but I do want to get your thoughts on one thing, because we know that Canada is looking to create this foreign agent registry. La Presse says a bill will be tabled either this summer or the fall. What do you make of that initiative?
I think it's a good initiative, but we need to understand the limitation of it. It's only like the lobbyist registry. There's a lobbyist registry that exists as we speak. It doesn't prevent the lobbyists to have a private dinner with some officials and to do their pushing as they want. So we need to be informed, and we need to know who is who. The elected officials or office, the people in office must report and keep track of what they're discussing with these people. But it will have a limited influence and capacity to prevent foreign interference. So we have to be very conscious of that. It's good, but not enough.
Michel Juneau-Katsuya, thank you for this. I appreciate the time.
Always a pleasure. Thank you again.
Well, let's continue the conversation with our journalists this week. Tonda MacCharles is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, Bill Curry, the Ottawa Deputy Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, and Joanna Smith, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press. Hello to the three of you.
Hey there. Yeah.
So listen, Tonda, I'm going to get you to start us out here, because we just heard Michel Juneau-Katsuya essentially say that CSIS gave warnings to successive governments, and they ignored those warnings about China and potential interference. What's your reaction to that?
I mean, I think actually that we've heard the fact that CSIS has been giving warnings to governments for years. And in fact, I mean, back in 2010, we were hearing the same thing during the Harper government years. I think the fact that governments have been warned that there are potential concerns around, be it espionage or what have you, there are concerns that diplomats engage in things that are not always diplomatic, right? I think, you know, the more shocking thing that the ex-agent said was that 70% of the diplomats should be expelled and for spying. I mean, if CSIS has that kind of information and solid information that the government could act on, we might have expected to see some action. But look, it's a very delicate relationship. It's a relationship with a major global power that many, many businesses and sectors in Canada's economy do business with. So there are huge implications of a decision to expel diplomats. Mm-hmm. Now, we haven't expelled a Chinese diplomat since the 70s. So the fact that they've got one out, that's, you know, that was very interesting. But there weren't a lot of voices of opposition within the government. Everybody was just focused on, you know, doing it carefully to make sure there isn't escalating reprisals and blowback.
Okay, well, Joanna, I'll get you to pick up on that because, you hinted a bit that we have this delicate relationship with China. Why ignore these warnings? If you're in government, you're hearing this from CSIS, why ignore it?
I think part of it, to pick up on Tonda was saying, was the global power and the trade relationships and what the business community wants to see. Everyone remembers, I think, who covers politics, back in 2006 when former Prime Minister Stephen Harper went to China on his first official visit. And he was rejected for a face-to-face meeting with the president because he refused to do it under the stipulation the conversation would only be about trade. And he famously said, we don't want, Canadians don't want us to sort of heed to the almighty dollar. We saw that line of thought evolve over the rest of his tenure as Prime Minister, much more focus on trade. There was criticism for not speaking out on human rights. So, he was sort of trying to contrast himself to the Team Canada approach of Chrétien and Martin. And then we saw, I think, some pragmatism seek in later on. And then I think back to the early days of Trudeau when they were talking about a free trade agreement, and they were trying to put human rights and gender and environment and labor into that. And China balked, and there was a sense that the Trudeau government was being naive and expecting these sorts of things too. So I think it is a delicate relationship. I understand the caution. I think we've just got to a point now where a lot of these things are becoming public, including things that are in fact very secret, becoming public, and there's a lot of pressure to do something about it finally.
But there's also, you can't ignore the fact that things have shifted in China. The regime that came in 2016 and under Xi Jinping changed over time, and so the relationship that governments have and the work that diplomats conduct changes over time given their marching orders. So it's not always been the same problem is what I would argue. And so I think that's reflected in how some of the governments have to deal with this country.
Yeah, and in one way which this government is trying to deal with it, they're looking into a foreign agent registry, although according to La Presse and to Radio-Canada, that some bill will come out either before or after summer. So Bill, talk to us about this registry. How would it address, Michel Juneau-Katsuya has talked about it a little bit before us, but how would it address the concerns being raised right now?
Well, I think it would be a step that they could take. It doesn't answer all of the questions. For instance, this is a system that's already in place in Australia and the United States, and diplomats are exempt from that. So it's not going to tell you which consul general is, which one's a spy. That's not what it's going to be. It's if you look at the U.S. database, which anybody can go online, it's quite interesting in terms of how detailed it is. It's even got things like Alberta's Canada Energy Office that lobbies in the United States on behalf of the energy sector. That is a foreign agent. Canada, in this case, Alberta, operating in the United States. So that's the kind of thing that's there. It's also got a lot of people who are consultants, former politicians, former staffers. So people you would see on panel shows like this and elsewhere. Former cabinet ministers, are they getting money from a foreign government? Well, in Canada, that's not immediately obvious. Now you could look it up. So it would be helpful for journalists when we're talking to sources, who's funding this person. Yep. Consumers of news, if they see somebody making a statement on TV, they can look it up. Who have they received money from? You can see the details. So it's an extra bit of transparency, but it doesn't really get at the question that we've had in the news the last few days about which diplomats are acting beyond a traditional diplomatic role and venturing into spying.
Yeah,
do you list anyone who is employed or paid by the Chinese government, or do you list anyone who's controlled or paid or doing any work or lobbying for a state-owned agency? And is it which countries? Mm-hmm. Is it every country that has any state-owned agency that has or enterprise that has people working on their behalf in this country? It's pretty complex. It's pretty fraught with all kinds of questions for, the drafter of that legislation.
Yeah, so again, we're now expecting it either before or after the summer break, so close eyes on that. But while you're here, I also want to talk to you in particular, Tonda, because earlier this week you wrote a report about an internal government document that essentially critiqued the response to the fall of Kabul and getting Afghans who helped Canadian forces out of that country. And part of that report was essentially pointing a finger at government, that it was hard to get direction from government because essentially, this is how I read it, they were too concerned about the election that they called on the same day.
I mean, it doesn't expressly say that. What it does say, however, is it documents the very huge challenge of the government trying to coordinate all the responses that needed to be coordinated, both immigration measures, who do you let in, who can't you let in, the security screening of it, the D&D evacuation, what the soldiers on the ground in Kabul were doing, and foreign affairs interest in trying to deal with the diplomats and the embassy. And so it documented sort of the whole build-up from, say, the year before to the fall of Kabul, which was on election day, and how, frankly, to me, there was a big, I was shocked at how late everything did come together and how much chaos there was inside government about trying to pull these things together. And then once the election was called, I mean, you will all remember, like 2 days before the election was called, they rolled out new immigration measures to bring in Afghans. They had expanded a program beyond just locally engaged staff, which they announced in July, to all the interpreters and workers and contractors who'd helped. But in the end, it was a mad scramble on the day and the days after Kabul fell to get vulnerable people and people at risk out of Kabul. The election complicated, because you'll remember the whole first week of it was dominated by these questions and those pictures of people falling and chasing planes and falling off and, violence at the airport. The election, the ministers were still minister even while the government was in a caretaker mode. And they were also constantly trying to deal with things. But there's no question it complicated the whole effort. And there was a very lack of a paper trail to document the decisions that the government was making on the fly and what was a valid decision, what wasn't. Now, looking back, it's sometimes hard to tell. There are lawsuits going on this very day to examine, who did have authority to put Canada's stamp on authorities to get out of Kabul and come into Canada. These are very litigious questions now. And, that report took a hard, cold look at how the government didn't anticipate early enough and how it responded on the fly.
Well, I remember when Kabul fell, and it was for days after. It was this: how do we cover an election all of a sudden when this real crisis is happening in Kabul? It seemed a bit insensitive, considering what people were going through on the ground.
They were grilled every day, weren't they?
Yeah.
Just constantly.
Well, I was going to ask because you were here at the time.
Yeah, and I think it did feel a bit surreal and really dissonant, and I think that was ramped up by the fact that Canada had this presence there, right? There are global crises that are happening all the time during federal elections all the time. And this one struck because there was a clear sort of accountability line between Canada and responsibility there. And I think it's really also really impossible to separate it from some of the feelings of veterans and other people who had worked there, now feeling like their time there, which was obviously not easy for them, had been pointless, right? And maybe a sense of guilt for the people they had worked with, leaving them behind. So that sort of became part of the conversation. Speaking with all humility, I think a lot of journalists felt the same way, and were sort of involved in trying to reconcile that and work with that behind the scenes while also covering an election, holding the government to account for actions involving our work, which is a complicated thing to navigate. And so that sort of brought it to the forefront in a way that other global crises may not have been. But yeah, when I read Tonda's story, like that whole notion of them seeming caught off guard and the whole election forcing them into caretaker mode while also them recognizing how politically sensitive this was and how terribly afraid they were clearly of this running off the rails and ruining what they thought was going to be a good election for them was clearly at play. I think, just from what I remember hearing at the time, the public service story, like, this is caretaker, this is what we do, and then the ministers sort of wading in and maybe some lines of what you could say when maybe got crossed without the support of the regular machinery of governance that's normally there, without caretaker mode. So it was just a very complicated time.
Yeah, and it was hard to delve into a political when it's like there should be, covering this very human story. It's like, what do politics matter? There are people that are very much concerned for their well-being and their lives. The image of the mother throwing her baby over the airport gate to try to save her baby. Bill, when you looked at Tonda's report, what went through your mind?
I was struck a bit by one of the recommendations, which is that the government should focus on situations that are not necessarily probable but high risk. And you would think, well, isn't that what we have a public service for? Like, this should be, whether it's earthquakes or this kind of situation, we need to have plans for things that may not be likely, but that could happen. And, when that happens, then there should be a clear plan, because clearly, absolutely it caught people off guard, not just Canada, elsewhere, but a lot of unusual things happened. Our colleagues at the Globe have been writing about the situation with a senator, Mary Lou McPhedran, who was just issuing all these pieces of paper to people,
what I was alluding to.
And saying this is official government document. You can come to Canada, and they were not official documents.
Except that that's a point of contention because they were so desperate to get people out. It did come from a chief of staff to the defense minister from Global Affairs. So really, I think a lot of people. That's the other thing. Like a lot of people were making good faith efforts to try and get people out, right? But that chaos probably shouldn't be the norm. That's not tenable as a government operating procedure.
Yeah, but the result of which is that there are people that are stuck in limbo as to whether or not they should be coming to this country.
And actually, I mean, to Bill's point, we have seen, again, the government caught off guard by events in Sudan, but most Western governments did not expect that clash to erupt as it did. And what I accept that maybe they were surprised, but what I don't accept is that, one of the clear recommendations from this report was have a comms plan, talk to the public, let them know what our assets on the ground, our military soldiers are doing to get people out. We have not had that kind of transparency. We've had the odd briefing, but try and get an answer out of what the ships and the planes were doing at the fall of Sudan when people were being murdered in Khartoum. We just didn't have, that lesson wasn't learned.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, too. I mean, right after that election, Harjit Sajjan was no longer defense minister. I mean, all those emails flowing through his office.
He wasn't reading his emails.
Yes, exactly.
Which we found out recently as well. Okay, well, thank you for that. That is the time for this weekend, but really appreciate it. So to Tonda and to Bill and to Joanna, thank you for the time today.
Thanks, Michael.
We are nearing the halfway point in the Alberta election campaign, but it has been hard for many people to focus on politics right now, given the more pressing concern of wildfires burning in the province. Now, there has been some grumblings that voting day should be pushed back, but for now, May 29 is still voting day in Alberta, which means the campaigns are still moving forward, though perhaps differently than originally planned. To check in on the Alberta campaign, we're now joined by Janet Brown, pollster and principal at Janet Brown Opinion Research. Janet, really good to have you on the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, here we are about 2 weeks into this 4-week campaign, but topping the news in Alberta, as I said, are the wildfires, understandably, and not the election. So I'm wondering, have the wildfires affected the kind of attention the provincial campaign would usually be getting right now?
Well, I think definitely the fires are the top news story, and not to minimize them at all, but they're in a specific part of the province. So, the vast number of voters are not directly affected by it. So, yes, it sort of made the election situation a little bit unique. But the election is still going forward full steam, I would say.
But still, the wildfires, I guess, from a political front, they have afforded Danielle Smith this opportunity to show leadership in action. Has that helped the UCP leader?
Well, yes, so she has been able to show herself in action. She has been able to show herself in a positive light. But I think for most Albertans, the fire response really is something that they see the government as being responsible for. So, it's not the premier who's going out there and fighting these fires. It's firefighters. It's the administration. It's emergency preparedness services that are really kicking into gear here. And the premier has a role to play for sure, but she's a figurehead role. And so I think a lot of people aren't asking themselves whether the premier is doing a good job. They're asking themselves whether the government's doing a good job. Was this government prepared? Was some of the decisions this government made in the past around funding and that sort of stuff, are those things helping or hurting right now? But I think in terms of people saying, oh, look how great she's doing with the fire, I don't think that in itself is going to change too many votes because when these things happen, it's the entire government that kicks into gear.
And add to that, I guess, if we're talking about leadership here, is that old video of Danielle Smith resurfacing this week, comparing Valcke people to Germans who supported Hitler. And it does make me wonder about leadership and just how much of this election boils down to that one issue.
Well, these were shocking comments that she made, and it was only a couple years ago. It was 2021, so to make it seem like ancient history, it's not exactly that. She said disparaging things about people who went out and got vaccinated, which represents 70 to 80% of Albertans. She said that she was not going to wear the poppy, and a lot of people are upset that she politicized the poppy. So these statements are very troubling to people. But, you know, for the NDP, they've been harping on these things. They've been running sort of an attack ad campaign against Danielle Smith. So these things are hurting Smith, undermining her credibility, undermining her trust. But I think they've also sort of dominated the narrative, and it's prevented the NDP from really sort of putting forth a positive narrative. So you've got a lot of Albertans out there right now who are feeling uncertain about the judgment of Danielle Smith, but not feeling confident enough that they know what the NDP platform holds for them to be able to switch over to the NDP.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned platform, and I do want to talk a bit about Calgary, because we've seen some announcements that would affect Calgary in the future being made this past week. But of course, Calgary identified as the main battleground right now. Just how many seats are actually in play in Calgary? And if you will, put that into some context for people outside of Alberta.
Well, let me back up even further. There's 87 seats provincially. 20 of those seats are in Edmonton, 26 are in Calgary, and the rest, 41, are outside of the two major cities. Now, I would be very shocked if the NDP didn't win every single seat in Edmonton and a number of seats in the surrounding area around Edmonton. I wouldn't be surprised if the UCP won most of the seats outside of the two major cities, maybe with the exception of places like Lethbridge and Banff Kananaskis and that sort of thing. So that's why we talk about this election being battleground Calgary. You know, it's shaping up to be a close election, but only because it's shaping up to be close in Calgary. I did a poll for CBC. That poll was conducted just before Easter. We released it just after Easter, so it's about a month old now. But at that time, I saw the NDP with the lead, and I saw the NDP in a position to probably win, you know, 18 out of the 26 seats in Calgary. But when you do the math, that's not enough. 18 seats in Calgary, 20 seats in Edmonton, that only brings them to 38. You need 44 seats for a majority. You need more like 47, 48 seats for a clear majority. So the NDP has to practically run the board here in Calgary and pick up some other seats outside of the two major cities. And even if they win the popular vote, it's going to be difficult for them to win all the seats they need to form a majority. Okay,
difficult. But what ridings will you be watching out for then, perhaps outside the two big cities where the NDP might be competitive?
Well, outside the major cities, the city of Lethbridge, it's in southern Alberta, which tends to be quite conservative, but Lethbridge is this little bastion of progressivism. So they have an NDP MLA down there now, and it's widely expected, there's two ridings in Lethbridge, it's widely expected that the NDP could get both. In Red Deer, I think the UCP has the advantage, but people are looking to see if the NDP could maybe pick up one seat in Red Deer. In northern Alberta, the riding of Lesser Slave Lake, it has been NDP in the past. It's got a big Indigenous population. People are watching that one. And finally, Banff Kananaskis, a very progressive riding, and that one could be on the ridings to watch as well.
Well, as you say, the elections campaign still going strong right now. So, Janet, thank you for the update at this point. Happily to say that you and I think are going to speak when we do get to Calgary at the end of the month. But for now, thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
A familiar name in Ottawa is planning to stage a comeback. Maxime Bernier, the former industry minister and foreign affairs minister under Stephen Harper, now leader of the People's Party of Canada. On Friday, Bernier announced that he will run in the Manitoba riding of Portage-Lisgar, which has been without a representative since Conservative MP Candice Bergen stepped down. He will run, as I say, once a by-election is called. Well, let's bring in our political strategist now to talk about Mr. Bernier's run. Susan Smith is principal at Blue Sky Strategy Group, Kate Harrison, vice chair of Summa Strategies, and James Valcke, director of research and strategy at Viewpoints Research. Hello to the three of you.
Hello. Michael.
Hello. Susan, I'll get you to start us out here. Do you think Mr. Bernier has a chance of taking the riding of Portage-Lisgar? And if he does, what would that mean for politics in Ottawa?
Well, it'll be a very interesting and I think fairly bloody contest in Portage-la-Prairie, a conservative safe seat held by Candice Bergen before. And Mr. Bernier tilts right. And for the Conservatives to beat him and hold on to the vote, they're going to have to tilt right. So if he comes in, regardless whoever wins that race will have appealed to that part of the party, and that brings that further right-wing social conservative voice to Ottawa. The Conservative candidate's an anti-vaxxer. For the nomination ran and won, against the Manitoba health minister. So it's going to be a very right-wing race. It will be a question of who outright wings the other. Mr. Poilievre's team will have to show the people who might vote Max Bernier that they can do that, while at the same time trying to reassure the rest of kind of middle-of-the-road Canadians that they're not tilting too far right. But I feel a crick in my neck tilting in the right direction at this moment, watching this race.
Oh, well, Kate, to give Susan's neck a break here, if Maxime Bernier does get elected, talk to us about the type of challenge that represents for Conservatives, because it's not just Maxime Bernier, but there's also other groups within the Conservative family that wants to challenge right now. Since Maxime Bernier would get more exposure if he's in the House, does that whittle away at the party's base?
It's a big if, and it is a hypothetical. I have a different perspective than Susan on the likelihood of Maxime Bernier's return to the House. Keep in mind, he didn't even win the riding for which he was an MP when he ran as PPC leader a couple of elections ago. Yes, the PPC has done well in Portage-Lisgar. I think last time they got about 20% of the vote, which is very high compared to other ridings. The Conservative candidate, though, in Candice Bergen, still won by a 30-point margin. So I think it is a big hypothetical. For sure, there's a tension. There always has been within the Conservative movement around the right and more of the center. And I think that, for the Conservatives, they kind of have to stick to what is authentic and true about the leader and his current policies, which is that small p populism. We've tried a couple Goldilocks approaches along the way of being quite right and more to the center under Aaron O'Toole. Now this is something different, and Conservatives will have to decide and see if it's successful once the next election concludes.
Yeah, not an easy task, though, for Mr. Poilievre, I would imagine, though, if they're going after the same voter base.
Yeah, indeed. But I also think that, Maxime Bernier's message is really concentrated around COVID pandemic restrictions. He hasn't been as vocal on some of the issues that Canadians are talking about. I don't think that he has really a clear message around cost of living, for example, the housing crisis. Certainly he's vocal on immigration. It's a position that's different than most Conservatives that you talk to in Ottawa, and one that seems to be different than what Poilievre has put forward. So I think that Bernier's candidacy is really focused on that disgruntled group of people that were against COVID restrictions. It's difficult to fight an election in 2023 when most of those restrictions were lifted in 2021. So I don't see Bernier's support translating into kind of a modern movement on the right of center.
James, what do you think? What kind of impact could Maxime Bernier actually have if he wins this riding?
If he wins the riding, it'll have a big impact. I mean, he is the candidate who doesn't seem to go away for the Conservatives. He is a thorn in their side, and he just keeps coming back. I think with the by-election, he is basically removing all the other challenges of other candidates that he had in the federal, and he is increasing his profile once again. I think Fred Delory, he wrote a piece on this and said this is a referendum on the Canada conservatism, really raising the stakes about what the outcome of this by-election might mean. However, I think that, what we really have here is a bit of a conservative narrative problem. Are they anti-vax populist, or are they establishment, pro-Volkswagen investment, government in waiting? And if you talk about the Volkswagen investment, you've also got the Oxford by-election coming up, and that was rife with nomination problems too. I think right now it throws a wrench into the Conservatives' narrative, and I suspect there's behind the veneer of Pierre's wonderful smile, there's some white knuckles in the party.
Okay. Well, of course, we're going to follow that by-election quite closely whenever it's called. But I also want to talk about passports while I have the three of you, because as you know, new changes were announced yesterday, the government focusing on the security aspects of this change, but some Conservatives taking issue with a redesign that removes images of Vimy Ridge and Terry Fox, just to name a couple. Take a listen to this exchange that happened in the House today.
He deletes Terry Fox, the soldiers that died at Vimy, the City of Quebec, the RCMP from our passport, to replace it with a coloring book that includes an image of him swimming at Harrington Lake when he was a boy. I announce that a common-sense Conservative government will bring back Vimy, bring back our memory of Terry Fox, bring back pride in our country, and restore a passport that all of us can be proud of.
It breaks my heart to hear anyone in this House politicize a Canadian hero like Terry Fox. That is something that the Fox family has prided itself on since Terry passed away in 1980. Not only that, during the convoy, Terry's statue was defaced here in Ottawa, and the members opposite were supportive of that convoy.
Okay, Susan, that exchange aside, have Liberals opened themselves up to criticism here for essentially not celebrating our past?
No. The passport
I'm sorry, you
was
said no?
designed in 20... No. I think Tempest in a Teapot, I was trying to think of some nice fancy alliteration for passport in your pocket and a fuss with a PH maybe. Look, our passport is the most secure travel document we have in the world. It guarantees our identity and our way, both in and out into other countries and back home into our own. The current design was done in 2013. The new design has been a process that's underway, and it's about security. It's about making sure we have a document that can't be counterfeited, that can't be copied, where people's identities can't be stolen, and the people who aren't supposed to be in Canada don't get into Canada with Canadian documentation. That's what this is about. I'm a bit baffled by Mr. Poilievre's attacks on this. I don't find it actually that mature, that statesman-like. And it seems like not a kitchen table issue for Canadians. We need the most secure documents in the world. We need our ID lasered in. That's what this is about. Passports have refreshes over years. This is the current version, and he should just, I don't know, maybe use it to travel across the country and visit some other places in the world and get some perspective about issues that are really important.
Well, Kate, I'll bring you in here because, I take what you're saying, Susan, but I have to say, listening to some public radio, I go on the internet and listen to public radio oftentimes from across the country, and there are Canadians that are very upset that they have removed images of Vimy Ridge and Terry Fox. So Kate, what do you make of this issue?
Yeah, I think if you are a traditionalist and a conservative who takes a lot of pride in national history, you're probably looking at this document and not understanding why some of those things would be removed. And I would agree with Susan that there are bigger fish to fry. I think one of those fish are actually getting your passport on time. And I think that having this whole redesign distraction, when just last week the government came out and said, we know that the PSAC strike is over, but expect your passport processing to still be delayed. To me, that's an example of the government focusing more on virtue signaling with things like this, as opposed to actual service delivery for Canadians. And it's not just this, Michael. It's things like removing religious symbols from the coat of arms, the whole debate that happened around changing the words in the national anthem. So again, if you're a traditionalist and a conservative, you're looking at these things collectively and wondering why on earth this is the Trudeau government's priority right now.
So James,
Michael, hang on a second
go
though.
ahead.
Just quickly, Michael, this process was started in 2019. Kate sort of makes it sound like, they just decided to bring this up and launch this now. That's not, in fact, the case. These are things that take a lot of time to do from a security perspective.
They could have deferred the rollout of until such time as more people were getting their passports on time.
Well, I think, but they've also launched, as part of this, they've also launched a new online application process, actually. So it does dovetail with people being able to more conveniently get their passports. Look, I think the Conservatives are making a whole lot of noise out of nothing.
Okay, go ahead, James. I know you're trying to get in there.
This is a rookie level mistake in year 8 of an incumbent government. This should have been a slam dunk. Increased security for Canadians. Everyone's safer. Headline. over, end the day, move on. But instead, they were caught flat-footed on something that should have been easily revealed during testing. And what that tells me is that the rigors that they've been holding in government are shaking a little. Like the car's going down the highway, but it's shaking a little bit. And whoever is holding onto the wheel better get it in control real quick. So is this a big issue? I mean, of the top 100 issues Canadians are facing, this probably wouldn't make it. But it's issue like this week, and another little thing next week, and another little thing next week, that adds to that narrative that things are kind of not being managed correctly, and I think that they need to quash that soon.
So you see this as essentially an unforced error on the part of the government?
It's an own goal. Absolutely it is. They should have known this. They should have been prepared for it. And the fact that they were not shows that they didn't have the processes in place to launch it the way they wanted to. Like I do focus groups. You show creative all the time and you test against old things, and someone would have brought up, why are we getting rid of this? And that's a question you should have had prepared, and it seemed like they weren't quite ready for that.
Okay.
I think a focus group, if you'd stop...
Sorry, one at a time, Susan, very quickly, one at a time,
If you'd stop anybody before the street yesterday and ask them were there pictures in their passport, I'm not sure they would have said yes, let alone being able to identify what was in them. People pull out their passports when they're using them. Otherwise, they sit in a safe spot in their safety deposit box or their drawer or their cupboard for wherever they can reach it when they travel.
Kate, last word to you.
It was an own goal that also lines the coffers of their main opposition's pockets. And I think that's the other part of this. There's been so many things in recent months that the Liberals have served up on a silver platter for Conservatives, motivated ones who care about issues like this, to then turn around and donate to Poilievre. I'm not sure how tactically that makes any sense for them, for something, to Susan's point, that so few people care about to begin with.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you for the discussion today. Susan, Kate, James, take care. Safeguard that passport in your sock drawer.
Thanks, Michael.
Take care. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.
What would a Conservative government do if they were elected to power? Well, that was the question put to Canadians by the research firm Abacus Data. And to discuss the findings, we're now joined by the chair and the CEO of Abacus, David Coletto. David, good to see you again.
Great to see you, Michael.
Listen, obviously the Conservatives don't have a campaign platform right now, so really no specifics. But I guess this is based on what Canadians have heard from Mr. Poilievre and therefore formed an opinion. Talk to us about your polling and what Canadians believe that the Conservative leader would do if he actually were elected Prime Minister.
Yeah, and really the objective here is to understand what their perception is, right? What would a government do? You're right. No real policy has been put out there, but there is, some pretty clear signals from people on what they think a Poilievre-led government would do. For example, a lot of people, more people think that that government would eliminate the national carbon tax, would defund the English language CBC, and almost half of those that have an opinion think that the Conservatives would make it harder for women to get an abortion, and about the same number think it would eliminate the national childcare program that was established by the Liberals. So those are the four in which a sizable number of people have some sense or believe that the Conservatives would do that. Whether they will or not is not what's important here. It's what the public thinks they're going to do, and that, I think, signals one, how effective they've been at communicating their opposition to the carbon tax, which is not new. Previous Conservative parties and leaders have run on that, and it's made a lot of focus on its promise to defund the CBC. But beyond that, you start to see where perceptions are on childcare and abortion, which is a real sticky issue for Conservatives.
Yeah, absolutely. And add to that, and again, based on your research, you've identified, or at least Canadians who took part in the survey, they identified to you their priorities, which they don't necessarily believe that the Conservatives will do anything about.
Correct. And the big ones are housing affordability. Almost every Canadian thinks the government, a future Conservative government, should focus on that. Taking climate change seriously, and balancing the federal budget in 4 years, plus, cut my taxes. So on the first two, those are two that the Conservatives, I think, have talked a lot about. For example, housing. You've got Mr. Poilievre out there talking quite often about how difficult it is for people to buy a home these days. Not enough, I think, people think the Conservatives are going to do anything about that, but there's an opportunity there for them. Issue like climate change, on the other hand, that's a real, I think, liability for the Conservatives, because even a sizable portion of those that are going to vote Conservative want the Conservatives to take that issue seriously, but not many think that it actually will. So that's an issue. Interestingly, when we look at the issue of abortion, for example, I mentioned earlier that almost half of those that have an opinion think the Conservatives are going to make it harder for a woman to have an abortion in Canada. But only 1 in 4 Canadians want that to happen. So there's another issue where the perception of what the government, Conservative government, would do is vastly different than what people want it to do.
Okay, so let's pick up on that point then, because here you have Mr. Poilievre, who really just took over the Conservative Party about 8 months ago. Given that this is the perception that Canadians have of him right now, after seeing him on the job on the Hill, giving his speeches, giving his news conferences, has this been a missed opportunity for Pierre Poilievre to essentially grow the party base?
I think to some extent. I mean, the first thing to keep in mind is not everybody is paying a lot of attention to what Mr. Poilievre is even saying. The numbers who definitely believe that the government, a Conservative government, would, for example, get rid of the carbon tax isn't that high, given how often they talk about it. So the first thing is to give them a little credit that not everybody is fully digesting everything that Mr. Poilievre is saying. But on the other hand, I do think there are clear signals in this data about where the opportunities are. Issues like housing, which they focused on, issues around taxes, which they focused on, are obvious strengths for the party. But where it gets into trouble, where there's more division, are issues like the CBC, climate change, and social issues or moral issues like abortion. So I think that to answer your question, I really think that I don't think they've done everything they've needed perhaps to do to build that tent, but what they've certainly done is motivated that Conservative base, and I think that's been job one for Mr. Poilievre, is to keep that Conservative family together, because there are risks with Mr. Bernier and the People's Party, and even this week we've heard of perhaps a new centrist Conservative Party coming into the mix. So he's trying to keep that Conservative family together. Yeah,
so keeping them together, but there is still, as you allude to, an opportunity here to grow the base if he focuses on the issues that identified by Canadians as being priorities for them.
Absolutely, right, and those priorities remain the cost of living and housing, healthcare, and taxes, which is part of the cost of living agenda. So, I'm always advising anyone who wants to connect with people in any audience is know what they care about, know what they want you to talk about, and that's a clear signal. So there's opportunities here for the Conservatives to continue to differentiate themselves from the Liberals, but also to speak to the issues that most Canadians remain worried about today, and that's really what this survey highlights.
David Coletto, appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
My pleasure, Michael. Take care.
The federal government expected it would happen, and in the early hours of Tuesday morning, it did. China expelling a Canadian diplomat in retaliation for Ottawa's decision to declare Zhao Wei persona non grata in Canada. Now, Zhao is the Chinese national identified by CSIS for targeting MP Michael Chong's family in Hong Kong. China's foreign ministry says Canada's decision to sanction Zhao was unscrupulous, and it is considering even further retaliation. With his reaction to Beijing's move, we're now joined by Henri-Paul Normandin, Canada's former ambassador to the United Nations, who also worked for several years in China. Ambassador, thank you for being with us this evening.
Pleased to join you.
So China is, as you know, promising to retaliate further beyond the expulsion of this one Canadian diplomat. What else might Beijing do here?
Well, I think that Beijing will have to weigh its options. On the one hand, as we know, China conducts a very aggressive diplomacy. So it is in the realm of possibilities that it may want to retaliate in terms of commercial links with Canada. They might find some problem with our canola or our pork. Not impossible as well that they may keep an eye on some Canadians in China. So that is a possibility. But this being said, I noted in China's reaction when they expelled the Canadian diplomat earlier today that they said to Canada, stop your quote-unquote provocations. If not, we might retaliate further. So that might be a sign that China will stop there. Because in terms of considering their options, if they imposed economic sanctions, it also hurts them at the time when China's economy is not going so well. Secondly, it brings the international spotlight on this incident. It is a little bit embarrassing for China to see one of its diplomats expelled for reasons of interference at a time when many countries complain about interference by China. So if they decide to escalate this issue, it will shed more spotlight on the issue. So I think China will have to weigh the pros and cons.
Mm-hmm. Weigh the pros and cons, as you say. You mentioned monitoring Canadians in China. I'm wondering if Canadian nationals need to be worried if they are in the PRC or in Hong Kong. And when I ask that, I'm thinking, of course, about the two Michaels being arrested when Canada carried out that extradition request for Meng Wanzhou.
I wouldn't go as far as saying that Canadians in China or Hong Kong are in danger. Yet we have to be conscious of experience. Also, there's a distinction between this situation and that of the two Michaels. In the case of the two Michaels, it was China's reaction to Canada arresting one of theirs, Meng Wanzhou. This is not the case here. So I would say, by and large, Canadians are not necessarily in danger, but they're not risk-free neither, given China's experience in retaliating against foreign countries. Further, China is currently clamping down on foreign firms in various ways. They've raided some offices, they've arrested some local staff, they've put in place exit bans. So it might be that at some point in time, some Canadians may feel the heat in China.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm wondering how China views this country. And I ask that because here we have this response, a warning that more may come. And I wonder about Beijing's view of Canada. There are countries that Beijing looks at and essentially sees as vassal states of the PRC, countries whose sovereignty Beijing ignores. How does the PRC view this country? Do they think that we are able to be pushed around?
I would venture to say the following. They see us, I would think, as a weak middle power, yet as a useful economic partner, and third, as a close ally to the United States, if not a vassal to the United States. I think that that's essentially how they see us. In terms of economic links, we have things of interest here for China, natural resources, technology, and so on. And further, our economy is closely integrated with that of the U.S., so that is of interest to China. And to put things in a historical perspective as well, China and Canada used to have a rather positive relationship, and I was part of that for a number of years. Going back to our shipments of wheat during the famine, to early diplomatic recognition, and so on. China used to respect us. But it's definitely not the case anymore. And they feel that, yes, they can push us around just like they're pushing around other countries around the planet.
So what can Canada do then? Beyond this one case with Michael Chong, we certainly know other Chinese diaspora in this country have complained about getting threats or feeling that they're not safe in this country. So what can Canada actually do to counter the PRC's meddling into Canadian affairs?
Well, the first simple thing to say is that Canada should decide to act. We've known for years that China conducts operations in Canada which are totally inappropriate or if not illegal. And yet we've let that happen in plain sight for years. And for the last few months, we've heard the government say, oh, well, we're sort of aware, but, we've conducted reports and investigations and we've created a committee and so on. But until very recently, we had seen no real action. The only two pieces of action we've seen more recently are first, this expulsion of a Chinese diplomat. And secondly, we've been told that the RCMP has finally closed the Chinese police stations, although we don't have the details. But that is as of recently. Until recently, we've just let things happen. So I think that we need to be much more proactive. When we see things that are inappropriate, well, our security services, our police, our politicians should be there on the ground to prevent things from happening. I think that is first and foremost what should be our overall approach. There's a lot of talk about a foreign agents registry. I think that would be relevant, although I have to admit it is a little bit complicated, but it would be one instrument amongst various that we could use.
And what about a public inquiry? As you know, that is being debated right now, possibly being considered by David Johnston, the former Governor General, as he looks into foreign interference. Would a public inquiry help, at the very least, to make sure that every Canadian comes to know the actions of the PRC in this country?
Well, I think that for sure we need a full inquiry which will go in depth about the activities of China and other countries as well, and which also goes in depth in terms of what the Canadian government has done or has not done, and leading, of course, to what we should do in the future. Now, there's a lot of talk about the possibility, a lot of demand actually for this inquiry to be public. At this stage, it is probably the way to go, because Canadians had a thirst for knowledge on that file, and they want to know the state of the situation. So if I had to bet at this point in time, I would say that Mr. Johnston, when he comes out later this month, will probably recommend a public inquiry. But public or not, the important thing is that it goes in depth, and that afterwards this information should be communicated to Canadians, respecting, of course, some limits in terms of secrecy and so on. But the bulk of the information should go to Canadians. And I take example, amongst others, on Australia, which has taken a much more proactive approach in terms of communicating with its public on what it is doing in terms of interference.
Henri-Paul Normandin, thank you very much for the time today. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
And that is our program for this weekend. I'm Michael Serapio. For all of us here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We'll see you again next time.